Okay, so the README for today, we're going to go over kind of the fine. We've been, incrementally working up to this, like containerizing certain things, deploying certain things, but here's the final version. So I'm going to clone this repo down. It up. And I'll go ahead and we'll take a look at the README real quick. So this is the standard, dummy application. It's got Django REST framework, API in the back end, React front end, and which is served up using Nginx. And then there's a Postgres database. So it's all stuff we've seen, over and over again. So just so you know that we're going to use Docker Compose, but you can also, the way that you describe things in Docker Compose has an analog, and you could just use regular Docker to run the container and just pass all of these arguments individually. So you could run a container, have a port mapping to 8,000, and then add a bunch of environment variables. You can do it that way. You can also do it here in the Docker Compose file. And then there's basically two versions of things. There's a local development version and then a production deployment version. So basically everything is doubled. And I'll just walk through that real quick. So I'll start with the development stuff. Yeah, I might as well walk through the application real quick. This is the wines stuff, which we've seen a million times. So I don't think you really need to talk about that. And same thing with the front end. So never mind, I'm not going to talk about it. The Docker Compose dev. Let me zoom in, do this one. Okay. So this has got 3 services. It's got the API. Again, these are arbitrary names. We can call these whatever we want, but these will be the names of the containers that you can refer to inside of other containers. So these will actually be mapped to IP addresses. So just like going to example.com, you don't just directly go to example.com. You go to a DNS service, which looks up the corresponding IP address, and then you go there. So same thing inside the Docker network. You can refer to containers from other containers just using the name, and Docker networking has its own local DNS, which can look up the name and then resolve it to an IP address and connect you. So it's a nice convenience. But so these are the containers, API. This is the Docker stuff, and we're passing in some environment variables. So the secret key, this refers to, you go to settings. Where is that secret key? So when you just create the app, it generates a secret key for you, which is a long, gobbledygook string. But this is meant to be a secret, and it's used for things like authentication and authorization, and we don't really use it, but it's also used for things like CSRF tokens. But this is something that the application needs, and it should be a secret, so you don't want to check it into source code. So that's why we're using an environment variable. And when you actually run it in production, you can pass that key in. So you can use one while you're developing and a different one when you deploy. And then debug mode. Again, when you deploy in production, you want this to be false. It won't give you detailed error messages, basically. And then allowed hosts. This is, this is the loosest setting, but it's fine to leave it like this, but ideally this would be the IP address where of the EC2 instance where this is deployed. But this is fine for now. And then everything else is basically the same. We got the usual database connection string, and we're getting these credentials from the environment. So the database, the name, the user, and the password, that's all coming from the environment variables that you pass in through the Docker file. So all of this stuff, with the exception of the database name isn't really sensitive. And this is not sensitive either. So these two are not sensitive. The other three are sensitive credentials. And in, like the actual production, like on the job apps, you'll have, slightly more robust ways of handling stuff like this. But environment variables are good. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so we're going to run the API, and we're going to, at least locally, we're also going to expose port 8000. And we're doing that in part so that you can directly interact with the API. Like if you need to debug something or check something, you can directly interact with the API rather than, oh, I have to go through the front end to interact with the API. So just to help you debug, but in production, you're not going to have that port exposed, because in production, requests come from outside and they only go to port 80 on the Nginx container. So there's no way to interact directly with the API from outside. And then here with the Nginx container, all we're saying is we're going to use this Docker file, which is in here, web server Docker file. And this one's a little different, a little more complicated. And all of this is basically to get us here, which is the thing we've seen before, where we're just going to copy over all of the built, the HTTP or HTML, JavaScript, CSS files, and drop it in this default directory inside the Nginx container. But instead of you having to manually say, okay, I'm going to manually run the build to transpile all of the React stuff, this is going to do it for you. So this is a pattern called a builder pattern. And the way it works is we're basically going to create like an intermediate container that we're not going to use in the final product. The final product is going to be this. We just want an Nginx container. But what we want in that Nginx container is stuff that has to get built. So in order to build it, we need to have Node, because in order to execute, for example, if we go to the front end, if we want to execute vite build, we need to have Node in order to do that. But we don't need Node in the final Nginx container. So to minimize those extra dependencies, we can kind of build this as a separate step. So we're going to build a container, we're going to generate this file, and then we can just put the file into this final container and then trash this intermediate container. So that's why this pattern exists. There's oftentimes when you're doing stuff, you need some intermediate result, but you don't need that in the final container. So you just build it as usual, except you give it an alias, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm calling it builder here, and then note down here that we're referring to the builder container -- from builder, and we're going to grab this front end dist, which we're going to get from running this command in the builder container. Any questions about that? So this is a more advanced Docker technique. But all this, this is the template that you can use. So All right, and then here what we're doing is we need, at least for this application, we, you know, we need the IP address of the Django API. And when you're developing locally, either just straight locally or in containers locally, you can use localhost. But once it's actually deployed, it's not going to be on localhost anymore, right? Because I'm a client somewhere on the internet. I go to your IP address. I get I get your web page, and then from that web page, the web page needs to make API requests back somewhere to get information, and that's not going to be localhost, right? So this will change depending on your environment, if you're in production or if you're in development. So we need to make this configurable, and environment variables are a good way to inject configuration. So I'll go to the front end app right here. We look at source, and then I'm not sure where it is. Let's see. Okay, so here is where I'm making that request, at least one of the requests. So whatever this is, and you can look at the Vite documentation. I in the optional lecture last week, I talked about this, so you can refer to that, or refer to the documentation. This is how you refer to an environment variable. Note that it starts with Vite underscore. So import.meta.env.vite underscore, whatever you want it to be. And here we're supplying that. So that's it. So we need this environment when we build the image. So there's a difference. We need it because these files are going to get built and put in the container. So we can't just supply this at runtime. We have to supply this when we build it. Okay, so that's the Nginx container. And then, this is going to be exposed on port 80. So on the EC2 instance, you're basically going to allow traffic to come in to port 80. And when that traffic comes into the EC2 instance, it's going to get mapped to this Nginx containers port 80, which is going to take care of everything else. And then lastly, the database, which you've seen before, we're just going to use the base image. We don't need to really do any very specific customization. We're just going to pass in some environment variables so that it knows what database it needs, and then the credentials. Any questions about that so far? Okay, so how do we run all this stuff and get these environment variables? So we take another step back, and we're going to use a script. So this run compose dev script, this is where we're going to supply these environment variables. And here, just because it doesn't really matter what they are, honestly, when you're developing locally, we're just hard coding these, and it doesn't matter if this goes into if this gets checked in to your public GitHub repo, because these credentials are only used when you're developing locally, so it doesn't matter. So that's why they're hard coded here. And then you're basically going to supply your shell session with all of these environment variables like secret key, debug, Postgres, DB, and your Docker compose file is smart enough to pick them up. So if you supply these variables, they're available in the environment in the shell session where you're running this, and so the Docker compose file can pick it up. And we're just going to run compose. you can modify any of these commands as you see fit. And then we're doing the lazy instead of actually pulling the container to see if it's ready. We're just gonna wait 10 seconds, and then we're gonna run migrations. So the names of this container, depending, you'll probably have to end up changing these. So this is going to be based on the directory. So Docker Compose app. Notice that I'm in Docker Compose app, and then API. So this is the name of this. So whatever name you give it is going to show up right here. And then -1. This is basically how many instances of this container you have. In this case, we just have one. So it's whatever file or whatever directory this is in, the name you give it in the Docker file, and then it's going to be one since we only have one of everything. So that's where that name comes from. Any questions about that? Okay, let's move on to the prod versions of everything. So the prod versions will be very similar, but just with basically the main difference is that we're not going to build images from local Docker files. So in the dev Docker Compose, notice that the API, it gets built from the Docker file that's in backend right here. But when we're in production, we don't want to have to push up all of our, I mean, you could do that, but we don't want to push up all of our source code to have to run this. So instead, we're going to refer to an image that we have in your Docker Hub account. And we'll talk about how you get it there in a second. But so this is going to be an image that you have in your Docker Hub account. It's going to be versioned. So every time you push up a new version of your application, a new container, it'll be 1.1, 1.2, 2.3, whatever version you want to give it. Same thing with the Nginx container, and then the Postgres container is the same because we're not it's not really customized. We're just going to use the base image. But these two we're going to have to get from Docker Hub. Okay. And then the prod script is very similar. So one difference is I'm exporting this Docker Hub username, which I'm using here. You don't have to do that. You could hard code it, but since it appears twice, I'm just putting it right here. So you can modify that to whatever your account is. And then here, we're not hard coding these values anymore. So in the dev script, we just hard code these because it doesn't really matter. You can change it to whatever you want. Here, in the prod run compose, we don't want to hard code this because this file is getting checked into our source code. So if we put a secret key here, it's going to get checked in and anyone can access it. So we want this to just be injected the moment that we need it. When we're on the EC2 instance and we're running it, that's it. So this $1, this is basically the first argument that you pass in. And $2 is the second argument that you pass in. So when you run the script, it'll be something like /run compose prod, and then you'll pass in, my secret, and then debug false, and Postgres DB, my VB, etc. So all of these things are going to be arguments that you pass into this script. Okay, and the arguments are going to be the usual stuff, and then also the version. So this is the version of the container that you want. So if you're on version 2.5 or whatever, you pass in 2.5 here. And that version information will get used here because it's going to pull not just your container. And by the way, you can change this name to whatever you want. It doesn't matter. But the version, I go to the Docker Hub account. I pull the image. By default, it'll just pull the latest image, but you don't really want to rely on that. It's better to have a specific version, so you know exactly what you've got deployed, and you could roll back to a previous version. If you make some changes and you push to prod, and it's like, oh, there's a bug. It blew up something. We didn't catch that. You can just revert to the previous version. But if you use latest, it gets kind of messy. Okay, and then everything else is the same, basically. It's just going to build and then run it, and then run the migrations. All that stuff is basically the same. Okay, so what is this? How do we push up the images? So you can run this script right here. Let me talk a little bit about the workflow. So the workflow will be, you'll set up your repo, you'll make changes. Let's say, I want to add another model to my backend or whatever. I write the code, I create my branch, I write the code, I test it locally, I make sure it's working, blah, blah, blah. And then I merge it in. So I merge it to main or master or whatever, the primary branch. And then you say, okay, I'd like to create a release. I basically want to push this to prod now. Like this is the new version of the application. So you can create, basically you'll create a release. So you'll then run this script, which will build your Nginx and Django API containers, and we'll push it to your Docker Hub account. So this one, I don't think I have versions on this. But here you see the tag. So this is not a great example, but there's two different tags. So if I pull this, depending on the tag, but you'll have, if you go to the Docker Hub account and you've been doing this for a while, you'll see a list of different versions of your container. So you'll develop, you'll push to main, you'll say, okay, this is good to go to prod now. You'll run this script and make sure to update the version. This will build the images. Again, you can change this stuff if you want. And then push it to Docker Hub. Once it's on Docker Hub, then you go into your EC2 instance and you can run your prod compose file, and it will pull in whatever that new version that you pass it is. So, there's a number of steps here. It's possible, this is kind of like middle ground in terms of how automated all this is. You can, I talked about Terraform last week or the week before. So there's definitely ways to if you really want to do, single push of a button deployment, you can, but it involves additional complexity. So I think this is kind of a middle ground that requires a fair amount of manual steps, but allows you to see what's happening. Any questions? Okay. yeah, it's something that you'll figure out as you use it. Um, and your goal, we're not going to worry about that so much for this mini group project, but when it comes time for your actual group project, in part because it's much longer, you basically want to deploy. You want to deploy early and often. So typically, the tendency is going to be, okay, let's develop the application. We'll keep developing locally until it's perfect, and then the very last instant we'll deploy it. And then when you do that, inevitably there are issues. So what you want to do, and what you'll do in the on the job, is you'll deploy very often. So the pace of your deployments can vary depending on where you work and what you're doing, but it can be many times a day. It can be once a week. It can be once every month. Whatever it is, it's going to be a continual process. So you'll want to, as soon as you get your MVP, you deploy it, and then you develop new features. You push them. You push it up. You test it locally. Make sure it works. You push it up. You create a release. You push it to prod. You test it in prod, and and that's the process. So deploying should be just a normal part of the development cycle. So I just want to encourage people to do that. All right. No questions. I will stop the recording.